Okay, in this session we're going to continue with sources of rejection, and we'll begin with talking about conditional acceptance. A number of people hold rejection beliefs learnt through only receiving acceptance if they perform to and meet the standards that have been set for them. And these expectations could relate to behaviour, being tried to be made perfect in our behaviour, or even something such as academic or other kinds of achievements. Could be sports achievements, something like that. And we only receive acceptance if we meet the standards that people put there for us in these areas. So fundamentally, what's being projected onto them spiritually and emotionally is, if you don't measure up by doing this or that, then you're not good enough and therefore you're not acceptable. Some parents have such high standards for their children that they create a breeding ground for what we call performance anxiety, which is anxiety that comes because you feel like you're not performing well enough. And then eventually that will become depression. So if a child is, for example, only ever criticised and told that they're not enough, then the consequent belief will be that no matter how hard they try, they will never be able to be what they need to be for acceptance. And this is an overwhelming belief that produces a sense of hopelessness and eventually depression. Inside the person, inevitably, the heavy load of never being, or the perception that they'll never be able to meet expectations, is too much for them and they become depressed. The devil offers them a way out, and oftentimes suicide is attempted. And we see a very high rate of suicide in nations, particularly some Asian nations, where there's a very high premium put on children being successful in an academic sort of society. And of course, there's so many people trying to achieve these high standards, then they end up feeling that they're not enough, because there are only a few that actually attain that. And it doesn't matter how good they are, they should always be better. All right, so it's wonderful when we see people access a depression belief and God speaks something into their memory and you hear them report something like, I'm okay, or meaning, I'm okay as I am, I can just be. I don't have to strive to be enough. I am enough just because I'm me. Christian parents can be as guilty as anyone because we sometimes meter out conditional acceptance based on performance of how good we are as a Christian, and we try to make them perfect. So a fear that our children may not be good enough for God leads us to impose all kinds of religious standards on them. In turn, they grow up seeing God as a person who is watching to make sure that you get everything right, even one mistake, and he will punish you. God actually doesn't expect us to be perfect. He knows that we're created beings in a hostile, fallen environment that we know as earth, complete with our old nature, which has a tendency towards sin, and a world full of temptations, along with a spiritual enemy who's constantly trying to deceive and gain sway over us by getting us to submit to him. So sometimes we need to forgive ourselves for being merely created beings formed from dust. God has. And then we can extend this grace and understanding that we've received from him by not demanding others and our children to meet our standards. And we see the great Psalm 103, where it begins in verse 10, says, He has not punished us for all of our sins, nor does he deal with us as we deserve. For his unfailing love toward those who fear him is as great as the height of the heavens above the earth. What he's looking for is us to actually have a reverence and a respect for him and be looking to submit to him. He's not looking for perfection. Then in verse 12, it goes on to say, he's removed our rebellious acts. In other words, not wanting to submit to him and then sinning as a result, as far away from us as the east is from the west. Now, the north and the south, there's an end to them, but the east and the west is ongoing. And then in verse 13, he says, the Lord is like a father to his children, tender and compassionate to those who fear him. Verse 14, for he understands how weak we are. He knows that we are only dust. So we need to realise that we are merely created beings that He's put the breath of life into. Remember, He created us from the dust, and so we should be able to give ourselves some room to not be perfect, is what I'm saying, and not expect to perform perfectly in everything that we do. Some parents use their child's success as a part of their own value because they feel rejected themselves. They think that if you succeed, it'll help shore up their own rejection and how they feel that they are perceived by society. Maybe they're even trying to protect you from the rejection that they feel, and they think that if they make you perfect, you won't be rejected how they have been. So in a sense, it's kind of love, but it's not from wisdom, because in doing that, they are actually perpetuating the problem. All right, the next thing we want to look at is inappropriate discipline. Now, excessive correction without love leaves a child to conclude that they don't matter, they're nothing, they simply live to fulfill all of your wants and needs. Now, if you have a genuine motivation towards your child, they understand this and they will actually receive discipline. If they feel that this is all about conforming their lives to you being pleased, and that you don't actually care about them or what they want or they need, that is them themselves, you don't care about them themselves, then this will read on their hearts as injustice, and that will produce rebellion. The same is true of not taking time to discipline your child. They sense that you cannot be bothered, and therefore their lives are an inconvenience to you. Now, you don't accept the responsibility for the outcome of their lives, and therefore they feel like they don't matter to you. When our daughter was beginning to stand and wobble around just before she started to walk, she would touch a pot plant or something, and then she would look around to see if this was okay or not. And I would say no, and then she would touch it again and look over again to see what would happen. Now I would get up and calmly go over, give her a little gentle smack on the hand. And this only occurred a few times, and at that very early age she learned that no didn't mean maybe, or it didn't mean if you try long enough you'll get your way, or it didn't mean if you want to you can, because after all you have rights. She learned that no meant no. From then on there was no further need to test this, because she already knew what would happen. No domestic violence. I never saw any of our children throw a tantrum, ever. So correction was done in love and as early as possible. Some people don't do it, and later on they end up hating the behaviour of their children, although they don't hate the child, but they possibly think that they do. And they've left it too late, and then they get angry or violent. Okay, now at the same time as this was happening with my small daughter, we had a friend with a daughter the same age. Now the father's response to his daughter's testing of boundaries was, give them what they want and they will leave us alone. Now even small children understand this as that they're not worth the time. There's an old jazz song that goes something like, it ain't what you do, it's the way how you do it. That's what gets results. And this is profoundly true. If you discipline your child in anger with a statement such as, you're really annoying me now, you're really going to cop it, who's it all about? It's all about you. It's about what you want and how they need to be good enough for your love and acceptance. The problem is that often parents don't take the time to discipline their children. Eventually, as we said, their behaviour becomes so unruly that the parents finally explode in anger and frustration and even violence. But if your child needs discipline and you calmly take them aside and you give them a hug and say something like, you know, I love you so much and you're not a naughty child, but you have done a naughty thing. We don't want you to grow up having a sad life and getting into trouble, so I have to punish you. Then having meted out an appropriate justice where the punishment fits the crime, you give them another big hug saying, I don't like having to do that, or I didn't like doing that, having to do that, but I love you so much I needed to, and I hope that we never need to do it again. Well, in that case, who has it been about? It's been about them. So it ain't what you do, it's the way how you do it. The discipline's the same, but now it's all about them instead of about them giving you what you want. It's been about what they need and they're good, and they will receive it and even appreciate it. But when it's all about you, you can expect problems. So we could say it's in the spirit that it's delivered in. And feel free to disagree with me, but this is my opinion and my experience. And as a pastor, I've had young parents with babies asking about how to bring up their children. And using these kinds of principles, I've seen their children growing up happily, knowing the boundaries. They've tested them, they know where they are, so that gives them security. They're well behaved, secure, and tantrum free. In fact, I recall one young couple who were continually receiving praise for their exemplary children. They'd asked us what to do. We told them, gave them these sorts of principles, and they did them, and their children were very well behaved. All right, I've already mentioned that we were in a foster care program for a number of years, and these children come pre-packaged with the problems. Some of the children who came to us had been branded ADD or these kinds of things. And using these sorts of principles, these children, after we dealt with them, would calm right down when they came into our home. So after a time, I began to interpret ADD, in many cases, obviously not all cases, as appropriate discipline disorder, because when they had appropriate discipline, these behaviours disappeared. Many of these problems did not exist when the Bible was the basis of raising your children. And we're in Africa doing ministry most years, and for probably on occasions more than a month at a time. I've never yet seen a tantrum or a badly behaved child. As the Africans are influenced increasingly by Western values and humanistic approaches to parenting, it does seem, and the access to media, it does seem to be just a matter of time, and they will have the same issues as we do, because they look at the wealthier nations as being successful, so you do what the wealthy nations are doing. But they'd be better off staying with what they are doing. So the only times I've ever seen perhaps even a tendency towards bad behaviour from some of these nations is the wealthier people who travel to the West, and you see them perhaps on an aircraft or in an airport, and these children are like our children. So it's actually the training that they get and the doing things how we do them that is the problem. So as we said, it ain't what you do, it's the way how you do it. That's what gets results. Proverbs 22 verse 6 says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. In other words, teach them how they should behave and respond to different situations, and that respect will be in them as they go along. Proverbs 22:15, so we're still in Proverbs 22, it says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction will drive it far from him. So it's the rod of correction, not the rod of violence or abuse or getting your own way. It's about teaching them the right way, and very often some children need some sort of physical payout to make it give them a good reason to resist bad behaviour. Okay, so the Bible treats dealing with children, correcting them in love, as a matter of absolute prime importance. Clearly, physical discipline is something only to be done when necessary, but if a child learns it early enough, you can expect a good self-controlled life for them into the future. In much the same way as we don't consciously access our heart beliefs that largely dictate our choices and behaviour, if we've grown up under discipline and we know that there's a consequence, we may no longer consciously know why we have a strong need to do what's right. It's now part of our heart programming learnt by experience. When my children became adults, they've enjoyed playfully pushing the limits with me and teasing and so on, but I still see in them a restraint as to how far they should go. Now, they may not consciously remember exactly what will happen, but there remains a sense of consequence and a certain amount of respect that was instilled when they were young. Someone's actually said respect comes before love, so that if they don't respect us, who are meant to be representing all aspects of God to them, then in all probability they won't have the necessary fear and awe of God that will protect them as well. So if we don't love our children enough to correct them, then that will leave them in a situation where they may well grow up lawless and without boundaries. They'll inevitably, this will inevitably leave them unable or not wanting to submit to the ultimate authority figure, who's God the Father. And sadly, we see over and over in these times children from Christian families, they grow up and they walk away from God because they only want their own way, which is what the world offers them, and the world's run by Satan. The parents can't understand what's happened. They've unwittingly brought them up in the ways of the world and not the ways of God. And oftentimes they're afraid to discipline their children because of their own fear of rejection, which tells them that they will be rejected if they bring correction, which simply isn't true. Proverbs 23 verse 13 says, do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell. Now, this is a very strong statement. It's saying that without correction and learning self-control, your child may not be equipped to resist the temptations of the world and run willingly to sin and end up being lost forever because they're not interested in God. They're only interested in what they can get from the world. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, we see the outworking of this lack of discipline in our times, and it starts from verse 1 saying, But know this, that in the last days times will come, for men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents. They'll be unthankful, they'll be unholy. So in a sense, the result of no discipline and learning to submit to authority leaves them living as their own gods, setting their own rules and boundaries. And then it goes on to say they'll be unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control. Now, first of all, you control them and you gradually teach them how to control themselves, and as they're able to, you let them have more control of themselves. Then it goes on to say they'll be brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. So they'll be brutal, meaning at times they'll even make sure they get their own way by force. They won't be caring about other people at all, and they're making pleasure the goal of their lives rather than God. So they are selfish people. They're all about themselves. They're self-consumed, self-obsessed, without boundaries and no consideration of others. Loving them by disciplining them as children is vital to them being able to live the ways of the kingdom of God in submission. All right. And finally, rejection comes to us very often through abuse. So that would be our fourth point there. It can be verbal, emotional, mental, sexual and physical abuses. They're all strong sources of rejection. Sometimes it's not even verbal abuse. It can be looks, disapproving looks, or people not wanting to deal with us. So it's the language of the spirit or the attitude behind all of these is something along the lines of you don't matter, you're just rubbish that has to fit in with what I want, you're a nothing. At heart level, matching beliefs will now end up held about your self-worth and acceptability. So these acts destroy how you perceive yourself, your identity, what you believe about yourself, and your value and importance. All right, we'll move along, and in our next study we're going to examine the results or some of the outworkings of rejection. So we'll see you when we return.